Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1892 brought with it an unusual chill to Philadelphia, one that seemed to seep through the imposing stone walls of Eastern State Penitentiary with a persistence that defied explanation. Dr. Edmund Thornfield, the institution's chief physician, would later describe in his private correspondence how the very air within those corridors had grown thick with an oppressive quality that made even the most hardened guards speak in hushed tones. The penitentiary, conceived as a revolutionary experiment in criminal rehabilitation through solitary reflection, had by then operated for over 6 decades. Its radial design, with 7 cell blocks extending like spokes from a central hub, was intended to facilitate both surveillance and the spiritual reformation of its inmates. Yet by the final decade of the 19th century, whispers had begun to circulate among the staff regarding phenomena that challenged the rational foundations upon which the institution had been built. Warden Samuel Creighton, a methodical man whose 20-year tenure had been marked by unwavering adherence to protocol, found himself documenting incidents that strained the boundaries of his pragmatic worldview. His final administrative report, discovered decades later in the basement archives of the Philadelphia Department of Corrections, contained entries that deviated markedly from the standard bureaucratic language that characterized his earlier writings. The document, penned in Creighton's distinctive hand, began with routine observations regarding the facility's operations during the autumn months. The inmate population had stabilized at 412 souls, each confined to their individual cell in accordance with the Pennsylvania system of separate confinement. The harvest season had proceeded without incident, with prisoners engaged in their assigned labor within the confines of their quarters, producing goods that would be sold to support the institution's operations. However, as October deepened into November, Creighton's entries began to reflect a growing unease. He wrote of guards reporting unusual sounds emanating from cells that had been confirmed empty during routine inspections. The descriptions varied, but common elements emerged: the soft scraping of metal against stone, as if someone were methodically working at the mortar between the blocks, rhythmic tapping that seemed to follow no discernible pattern, and most disturbing of all, what several guards described as the sound of weeping that would cease the moment they approached to investigate. Dr. Thornfield's medical logs from the same period corroborated these observations from a different perspective. He noted a marked increase in requests for medical attention among both inmates and staff, though physical examinations revealed no underlying pathology. Prisoners complained of persistent headaches, disrupted sleep, and a sensation they described as feeling watched despite the isolation of their cells. The guards exhibited similar symptoms, along with what Thornfield clinically termed heightened nervous sensitivity. The physician's training at the University of Pennsylvania had instilled in him a deep respect for empirical observation and rational analysis. Yet his notes from November 1892 revealed a man grappling with phenomena that resisted conventional explanation. He documented instances where inmates in separate cell blocks would simultaneously report identical nightmares, despite having no contact with one another. These dreams, as recorded in Thornfield's careful script, invariably involved figures from the penitentiary's past appearing in their cells during the darkest hours before dawn. Temperature readings throughout the facility began to show inexplicable variations during this period. The central heating system, a modern innovation installed only 5 years prior, functioned perfectly according to the maintenance staff. Yet certain sections of the prison, particularly in cell block 3, registered temperatures that fluctuated wildly without apparent cause. Guards assigned to these areas reported an uncomfortable chill that seemed to penetrate their heavy woolen uniforms, leaving them with a bone-deep cold that persisted even after they had left their posts. Warden Creighton's methodical nature led him to investigate these reports personally. His entries from late November described nocturnal inspections of the affected areas, conducted with the assistance of his most trusted guards. These expeditions, undertaken with scientific rigor, yielded observations that challenged his fundamental understanding of the institution he had overseen for 2 decades. The warden noted how their lanterns would flicker without apparent cause, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. Footsteps echoed through empty corridors, always remaining just beyond the reach of their illumination. Most unsettling of all were the moments of absolute silence that would suddenly descend upon the prison, as if the very building were holding its breath in anticipation of some unnamed revelation. As November drew to a close, Creighton's final entries took on an increasingly urgent tone. He wrote of his growing conviction that the penitentiary had become host to presences that defied rational explanation. Entities that seemed drawn to the accumulated suffering and despair that had permeated the stone walls over the course of 6 decades of human confinement. The stage was set for events that would challenge everything the warden believed about the nature of justice, punishment, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. December arrived with an unprecedented severity that seemed to mock the penitentiary's heating systems. Dr. Thornfield's medical journal from this period revealed a systematic approach to documenting the escalating anomalies, his scientific training compelling him to record even those observations that challenged his rational worldview. The physician had begun conducting what he termed environmental health assessments, though the true nature of his investigations extended far beyond conventional medical practice. The first significant incident occurred on December 3rd, during Thornfield's routine evening rounds through cell block 3. The block housed 47 inmates, each confined to their individual cell according to the strict protocols of separate confinement. As the physician made his way through the corridor, checking on prisoners who had requested medical attention, he became aware of an unusual acoustic phenomenon that defied logical explanation. From cell number 17, occupied by a convicted forger named Marcus Kellerman, came the distinct sound of multiple voices engaged in what appeared to be conversation. Thornfield's initial assumption was that Kellerman had somehow managed to communicate with adjacent prisoners, a serious violation of the institution's fundamental principles. However, upon closer inspection, the physician realized that the voices emanated from within the single cell, despite Kellerman being the sole occupant. The prisoner himself appeared to be in a state of deep sleep, his breathing regular and undisturbed. Yet the voices continued, their words indistinct, but their emotional tenor unmistakably agitated. Thornfield noted in his journal how the temperature near cell 17 registered several degrees lower than the surrounding area, despite the heating pipes running directly beneath that section of the floor. Similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency throughout the cell block. Prisoners reported conversations taking place in their cells during the night, though they insisted they were not the participants in these exchanges. The voices, they claimed, belonged to individuals they did not recognize, speaking in accents and dialects that varied considerably from the predominantly Irish and German immigrant population that comprised the majority of the prison's inmates. Dr. Thornfield's medical background led him to initially consider psychological explanations for these phenomena. The isolation imposed by the Pennsylvania system was known to produce various forms of mental disturbance among long-term prisoners. Auditory hallucinations were not uncommon in cases of prolonged solitary confinement. However, the consistency of the reports across multiple individuals, combined with the corroborating observations of the guards, suggested something beyond individual psychological breakdown. The physician began maintaining detailed records of the affected prisoners' medical histories, searching for common factors that might explain their shared experiences. His analysis revealed no significant patterns in terms of age, criminal background, length of incarceration, or previous medical conditions. The only consistent element was their location within cell block 3, specifically in cells numbered 15 through 22. Guard Captain William Ashford, a veteran of 15 years' service at the penitentiary, provided additional documentation that supported Thornfield's observations. Ashford's duty logs from December recorded multiple instances of what he described as unauthorized vocalizations, occurring during the mandatory silence hours between sunset and dawn. The captain's attempts to identify the sources of these disturbances proved consistently unsuccessful, with inspections revealing only sleeping prisoners in properly secured cells. The temperature anomalies that had first appeared in November intensified during the early weeks of December. Thornfield's measurements, taken with a precision thermometer borrowed from the University of Pennsylvania's medical department, showed variations of up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit within the span of a few yards. These fluctuations occurred without correlation to the building's heating system, weather conditions, or human activity levels. Most disturbing to the physician were the physical symptoms exhibited by prisoners housed in the affected area. Beyond the headaches and sleep disturbances previously noted, inmates began displaying signs of what Thornfield clinically described as acute nervous exhaustion. Their appetites diminished significantly, leading to noticeable weight loss despite the unchanged prison diet. Several developed a persistent tremor in their hands that bore no resemblance to any neurological condition documented in medical literature. The guards assigned to cell block 3 exhibited similar symptoms, though to a lesser degree. Captain Ashford reported difficulty concentrating during his duties, along with a persistent sense of being observed that intensified during the evening hours. 2 guards requested transfers to other sections of the prison, citing unspecified health concerns that prevented them from performing their duties effectively. Dr. Thornfield's journal entries from mid-December revealed his growing conviction that the phenomena transcended conventional medical or psychological explanation. His scientific training demanded empirical evidence, yet the accumulating data pointed toward conclusions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of rational inquiry. The physician found himself documenting events that seemed to suggest the presence of influences that existed beyond the boundaries of accepted scientific understanding. As December progressed, the incidents in cell block 3 began to follow discernible patterns, as if guided by some underlying intelligence that was gradually making its presence known to the living inhabitants of Eastern State Penitentiary. The third week of December brought an unexpected development that would fundamentally alter the investigation into the disturbances plaguing Eastern State Penitentiary. Miss Eleanor Pemberton, the institution's chief archivist and records keeper, had been conducting a comprehensive review of historical documentation dating back to the prison's founding in 1829. Her meticulous work, initially intended to prepare materials for the upcoming administrative audit, uncovered records that cast the recent phenomena in an entirely new light. Miss Pemberton's discovery occurred while she was organizing files in the basement storage area beneath the administrative wing. The archives, housed in a series of interconnected chambers carved from the same stone as the prison itself, contained decades of accumulated documentation spanning the institution's entire operational history. Among the yellowed papers and leather-bound ledgers, she encountered a collection of reports that had been misfiled and forgotten for nearly 3 decades. The documents, bearing the official seal of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, detailed a series of incidents that had occurred during the winter of 1863. The reports, signed by then Warden Jonathan Fairweather, described disturbances remarkably similar to those currently plaguing Cell Block 3. Prisoners had reported unexplained voices, temperature fluctuations, and the persistent sensation of being watched by unseen observers. What made these historical accounts particularly significant was their specific location within the prison. The 1863 incidents had occurred exclusively in what was then designated as the Isolation Wing, a section of the facility reserved for prisoners who had violated institutional regulations. This area corresponded precisely to the current location of Cell Block 3, which had been renovated and redesignated following structural modifications completed in 1875. Miss Pemberton's research revealed that the Isolation Wing had housed a particularly troubled population during the Civil War period. The facility had experienced severe overcrowding as military courts sentenced increasing numbers of deserters and conscientious objectors to terms of imprisonment. The harsh conditions of wartime, combined with the already severe regime of solitary confinement, had resulted in what the historical records euphemistically described as elevated mortality rates. The archivist's methodical examination of death certificates and burial records from the 1860s painted a grim picture of life within the Isolation Wing. Between 1862 and 1865, 43 prisoners had died while confined in that section of the prison. The causes of death varied, ranging from consumption and pneumonia to what period medical terminology classified as melancholia and nervous exhaustion. Several cases were attributed to what Dr. Cornelius Brennan, the prison physician of that era, described as sudden cardiac failure of unknown etiology. Most disturbing among Miss Pemberton's findings were the detailed reports filed by Dr. Brennan regarding the final weeks of several prisoners' lives. The physician had documented cases where inmates appeared to be responding to stimuli that were not apparent to observers. They would turn their heads as if listening to conversations, react with fear or agitation to empty spaces within their cells, and demonstrate what Brennan termed inappropriate emotional responses to environmental conditions. The historical records also contained testimony from guards who had served in the Isolation Wing during this period. Their accounts, preserved in disciplinary hearing transcripts and incident reports, described experiences that paralleled the current observations with unsettling accuracy. Guards reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors, witnessing shadows that moved independently of light sources, and experiencing sudden temperature drops that defied explanation. Of particular significance was a report filed by Guard Sergeant Thomas Aldrich in February 1864, describing what he termed atmospheric disturbances that occurred with increasing frequency during the winter months. Aldrich documented instances where his lantern would flicker without apparent cause, where sounds of weeping could be heard from cells that contained no living occupants, and where the very air seemed to grow thick with an oppressive quality that made breathing difficult. Miss Pemberton's research extended beyond the immediate records of the Isolation Wing to encompass broader institutional documentation from the Civil War period. She discovered correspondence between Warden Fairweather and state officials that revealed the administration's growing concern about the psychological impact of the disturbances on both prisoners and staff. Several guards had requested transfers, citing health concerns that prevented them from performing their duties effectively. The archivist's most significant discovery came in the form of a sealed envelope, marked with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of similar manifestations recurring within the facility. The envelope, bearing Warden Fairweather's personal seal, contained a detailed account of measures taken to address the 1863 incidents, along with his personal observations regarding their ultimate resolution. According to Fairweather's confidential report, The disturbances had ceased abruptly in March 1865, following what he described as the implementation of certain protocols designed to restore proper order to the affected areas. The nature of these protocols was not specified in the available documentation, though references to consultation with ecclesiastical authorities and specialists in matters of spiritual significance suggested approaches that extended beyond conventional administrative measures. Miss Pemberton's findings provided crucial historical context for the current situation, while raising profound questions about the cyclical nature of the phenomena and the possibility that Eastern State Penitentiary harbored influences that transcended the boundaries between past and present. The revelation of historical precedent for the current disturbances prompted Warden Crichton to implement enhanced surveillance measures throughout Cell Block 3. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, he authorized an unprecedented overnight observation protocol that would fundamentally alter the administration's understanding of the phenomena plaguing the institution. Guard Captain Ashford assembled a team of 4 experienced officers to conduct continuous monitoring of the affected cell block from sunset to dawn. The team included Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a 20-year veteran whose steady demeanor had earned him respect throughout the facility. Officer Heinrich Müller, whose meticulous attention to detail made him invaluable for documentation purposes. Officer James Donnelly, recently promoted for his exemplary service record, and Officer Samuel Garrett, whose background in military reconnaissance provided useful skills for systematic observation. The guards positioned themselves at strategic points throughout Cell Block 3, maintaining constant communication through a system of predetermined signals. Each officer carried a pocket watch synchronized to ensure accurate timing of any incidents, along with detailed logbooks for recording observations. Dr. Thornfield provided medical thermometers and other instruments to document environmental conditions throughout the night. The first hours of the watch proceeded without incident. The prisoners settled into their evening routines, and the familiar sounds of the institution's nighttime operations provided a backdrop of normalcy. The guards noted standard temperature readings, typical acoustic conditions, and no unusual visual phenomena. Their logs from this period reflected the routine nature of prison surveillance, with entries documenting scheduled rounds and standard security procedures. As midnight approached, however, the atmosphere within the cell block began to undergo a subtle but unmistakable transformation. Officer Müller, stationed near the central corridor, was the first to document the change. His logbook entry, timed at 11:47, described a gradual decrease in ambient temperature that occurred without correlation to the building's heating system. The thermometer reading showed a drop of 8 degrees Fahrenheit within the span of 15 minutes. Sergeant O'Malley, positioned at the far end of the cell block, simultaneously recorded what he described as an alteration in acoustic properties that made normal sounds appear muffled and distant. The usual nighttime noises of the prison seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt unnatural and disturbing. His attempts to communicate with the other guards through their established signal system met with unexpected difficulty, as if the very air had become resistant to the transmission of sound. At 12:15, Officer Donnelly documented the first visual anomaly of the night. From his position near cells 17 through 20, he observed what appeared to be movement within the shadows cast by the gas lamps along the corridor. The shadows seemed to shift and undulate independently of their light sources, creating patterns that suggested the presence of figures moving through the cell block despite the absence of any visible individuals. The prisoners within the affected cells began to exhibit signs of distress that were apparent even through the thick stone walls and iron doors. Officer Garrett noted sounds of agitation coming from multiple cells simultaneously, though the nature of the separate confinement system made communication between inmates impossible. The prisoners appeared to be responding to stimuli that were not apparent to the observing guards, turning toward corners of their cells and reacting with visible fear to empty spaces. Dr. Thornfield, who had positioned himself in the administrative area adjacent to the cell block, recorded dramatic fluctuations in his instruments during this period. The thermometer readings showed temperature variations of up to 12 degrees within individual cells, while a barometric pressure gauge borrowed from the university's meteorology department indicated atmospheric changes that defied explanation given the enclosed nature of the environment. The most significant incident occurred at 1:37 in the morning. All four guards simultaneously reported the appearance of what they described as translucent figures, moving through the corridor with purposeful intent. These apparitions, visible for only brief moments before fading from view, appeared to be dressed in the grey uniforms worn by prisoners during the institution's earlier decades. They moved with the measured pace of individuals familiar with the layout of the cell block, pausing at specific cells as if conducting their own form of surveillance. Officer Mueller's detailed description noted that the figures appeared to be examining the current occupants of the cells with what seemed like recognition or familiarity. They would pause at certain doors, appearing to peer through the viewing slots before moving on to the next cell. The guards observed that the apparitions showed particular interest in cells 17, 19, and 22, spending extended periods at these locations before continuing their nocturnal rounds. The temperature readings during these manifestations showed extreme fluctuations, with some areas dropping to near freezing levels despite the December night being relatively mild for the season. The guards reported physical sensations of intense cold that penetrated their heavy winter uniforms, leaving them with a bone-deep chill that persisted long after the apparitions had faded from view. As dawn approached, the phenomena gradually subsided, leaving the guards with detailed documentation of events that challenged every assumption about the nature of their workplace and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The morning following the Night Watch incident brought an unexpected development that would provide crucial insight into the nature of the phenomena plaguing Cell Block 3. Prisoner Marcus Kellerman, the convicted forger housed in Cell 17, requested an urgent meeting with Dr. Thornfield, claiming to possess information vital to understanding the recent disturbances. Kellerman, a man of 43 years, who had maintained an exemplary record during his 18-month incarceration, appeared visibly shaken when brought to the medical examination room. His physical condition showed marked deterioration since his last medical assessment 3 weeks prior. The physician noted significant weight loss, pronounced dark circles beneath his eyes, and a persistent tremor in his hands that had not been present in previous examinations. Dr. Thornfield's medical notes from this encounter documented Kellerman's account of experiences that corroborated and expanded upon the guards' observations from the previous night. The prisoner described a pattern of nocturnal visitations that had been occurring with increasing frequency since early December, always during the darkest hours before dawn, when the prison lay shrouded in its deepest silence. According to Kellerman's testimony, the visitations began as subtle disturbances that he initially attributed to the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. He would awaken to find his cell significantly colder than normal, despite the heating pipes that ran beneath his floor functioning properly. The temperature drop was accompanied by what he described as a change in the quality of the air itself, which seemed to grow thick and oppressive, making each breath require conscious effort. The prisoner's account detailed how these environmental changes preceded the appearance of figures within his cell. These apparitions, he claimed, were not the translucent forms observed by the guards in the corridor, but fully formed individuals who appeared as solid and real as any living person. They wore the grey uniforms of Eastern State prisoners, but their clothing bore the styling and cut of garments from decades past. Kellerman described how these nocturnal visitors would materialize in the corners of his cell, emerging from the shadows as if stepping through invisible doorways. They appeared to be unaware of his presence initially, moving about the confined space as if conducting their own daily routines. Some would pace the narrow confines of the cell with the measured steps of men accustomed to such limitations, while others would sit in corners, their heads bowed in attitudes of profound despair. The prisoner's most disturbing revelation concerned the apparent recognition that eventually developed between himself and these spectral inhabitants. Over time, the figures began to acknowledge his presence, turning their attention toward him with expressions that conveyed a mixture of curiosity and desperate longing. They would approach his cot, their movements silent despite the stone floor, and observe him with an intensity that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. Dr. Thornfield's notes recorded Kellerman's description of attempts at communication with these apparitions. The prisoner claimed that while the figures appeared capable of speech among themselves, their words reached him as indistinct whispers that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating instead within his mind. The content of these communications remained largely incomprehensible, though certain phrases recurred with sufficient frequency that he had begun to discern their meaning. The most frequently repeated phrase, according to Kellerman's testimony, was what sounded like "remember us," spoken with an urgency that suggested profound importance. Other recurring elements included references to the cold winter and the fever that took so many, along with what appeared to be names of individuals unknown to the current prisoner population. Kellerman's account extended beyond his own cell to include observations of similar phenomena affecting his fellow inmates. Through the ventilation system that connected the cells, he had become aware that other prisoners were experiencing comparable visitations. The sounds of agitated movement, muffled exclamations of fear or surprise, and the distinctive temperature drops that accompanied the apparitions were occurring simultaneously across multiple cells within the affected section. The prisoner's testimony concluded with his growing conviction that the spectral visitors were attempting to communicate something of vital importance about the history of Cell Block 3. Their persistent presence and increasingly urgent attempts at contact suggested unfinished business that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Thornfield's medical assessment of Kellerman revealed no evidence of psychological deterioration that would account for hallucinations of such complexity and consistency. The prisoner's mental faculties remained sharp, his memory precise, and his ability to distinguish between reality and imagination unimpaired. The physician found himself confronting testimony that challenged his scientific worldview while providing crucial pieces to the puzzle of Eastern states' supernatural manifestations. Miss Pemberton's continued research into the historical archives yielded a discovery that would illuminate the true nature of the spectral manifestations haunting Cell Block 3. Deep within a collection of medical records from the 1860s, she uncovered Dr. Cornelius Brennan's private journal, a leather-bound volume that had been sealed and forgotten for nearly 3 decades following his death in 1869. The journal, written in the physician's careful script, contained detailed observations of the epidemic that had swept through the isolation wing during the brutal winter of 1863-1864. Dr. Brennan's entries revealed that what official records had euphemistically termed elevated mortality rates was, in fact, a devastating outbreak of typhus that claimed the lives of 43 prisoners within the span of 4 months. The epidemic had begun in late November 1863, when overcrowding forced the administration to house multiple prisoners in cells designed for solitary confinement. The breakdown of the isolation system, combined with inadequate sanitation and the harsh winter conditions, created ideal circumstances for the rapid spread of disease. Dr. Brennan's journal documented his growing alarm as the infection moved through the population with relentless efficiency. The physician's private notes revealed details that had been omitted from official reports submitted to state authorities. The affected prisoners had experienced not only the physical symptoms of typhus, but also profound psychological disturbances that Dr. Brennan attributed to the fever's impact on their mental faculties. Many had reported vivid hallucinations involving deceased family members and fellow inmates, claiming that the dead were calling to them from beyond the grave. Most significantly, Dr. Brennan's journal contained detailed descriptions of the prisoners' final days when the fever reached its peak intensity. The dying men had spoken repeatedly of feeling cold despite their elevated body temperatures, describing sensations of being watched by unseen observers and hearing voices that beckoned them towards some unknown destination. Several had insisted that former cellmates who had already succumbed to the disease were returning to guide them through their final transition. The journal revealed that the epidemic had been deliberately concealed from public knowledge to prevent panic and protect the institution's reputation. Official death certificates listed various causes of death, carefully avoiding any mention of typhus or epidemic disease. The bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a section of the prison cemetery that was later built over during facility expansions in the 1870s. Dr. Brennan's most disturbing entries concerned his observations during the final weeks of the epidemic. The physician had begun to experience phenomena that defied medical explanation, including dramatic temperature fluctuations in the isolation wing that occurred independently of weather conditions or heating systems. He documented instances where his medical instruments would malfunction without apparent cause, and where the very air within the affected cells seemed to resist normal circulation. The journal's final entries, written in February 1865, described Dr. Brennan's growing conviction that the epidemic had left an indelible mark upon the isolation wing. He wrote of his belief that the intense suffering and despair experienced by the dying prisoners had somehow imprinted itself upon the physical structure of the building, creating what he termed atmospheric disturbances that persisted long after the last victim had been buried. Miss Pemberton's research revealed that Dr. Brennan had recommended the complete renovation of the isolation wing following the epidemic's end. His official report to Warden Fairweather, discovered among the sealed documents, advocated for the removal of all furnishings, the replacement of flooring and wall surfaces, and the implementation of extensive ventilation improvements. These recommendations had been partially implemented during the 1875 renovations that transformed the isolation wing into the current Cell Block 3. The archivist's investigation extended to burial records and cemetery documentation, confirming that 43 prisoners had indeed been interred in unmarked graves beneath what was now the prison's exercise yard. The location of these graves corresponded precisely to the area directly adjacent to Cell Block 3, separated only by the thickness of the prison's foundation walls. Most revealing was Dr. Brennan's final journal entry, dated March 15, 1865, in which he described his theory that the epidemic victims remained somehow connected to the location of their suffering and death. He hypothesized that their spirits, unable to find peace due to the circumstances of their demise, continued to inhabit the spaces where they had experienced their final agonies. The physician's journal concluded with his recommendation that the isolation wing be permanently closed and converted to other uses, warning that the concentration of death and despair within those walls had created conditions that might prove dangerous to future occupants. The convergence of historical evidence and contemporary observation reached its climax on the night of December 28th, when the phenomena in Cell Block 3 intensified to an unprecedented degree. Warden Creighton, armed with the knowledge gleaned from Dr. Brennan's journal and Miss Pemberton's archival research, had authorized a comprehensive documentation effort that would capture the full scope of the supernatural manifestations. Dr. Thornfield assembled an expanded team of observers, including several faculty members from the University of Pennsylvania's Departments of Medicine and Natural Philosophy. Professor Edmund Cartwright, a specialist in atmospheric phenomena, brought sophisticated instruments for measuring temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. Professor Marcus Aldrich, whose studies in acoustics had earned him recognition throughout the scientific community, provided equipment for analyzing sound patterns and frequencies. The observation team positioned themselves throughout Cell Block 3 at sunset, prepared to document whatever phenomena might occur during the night hours. Their instruments detected immediate anomalies as darkness settled over the prison. Temperature readings showed localized cold spots that defied explanation, while barometric measurements indicated pressure variations that suggested the presence of atmospheric disturbances within the enclosed space of the cell block. As the night progressed, the manifestations began with subtle environmental changes that gradually intensified into full apparitions. The spectral figures that appeared were no longer the translucent forms observed during previous incidents, but fully materialized individuals who moved through the cell block with the purposeful intent of the living. Their gray uniforms bore the unmistakable styling of the 1860s, and their gaunt faces reflected the ravages of disease and prolonged suffering. Professor Cartwright's instruments recorded dramatic temperature fluctuations that accompanied each manifestation. The cold spots, which had previously been localized to individual cells, now extended throughout the entire cell block, creating zones of frigid air that seemed to move independently of any natural circulation patterns. The temperature differentials reached extremes that challenged the limits of his measuring devices, with some readings dropping below freezing despite the heated interior of the prison. The acoustic phenomena documented by Professor Aldrich revealed patterns that suggested organized communication among the apparitions. His sensitive recording equipment captured frequencies that were barely audible to human hearing, revealing what appeared to be conversations conducted in voices weakened by illness and despair. The content of these exchanges, when analyzed later, consisted primarily of names and references to the epidemic that had claimed their lives 3 decades earlier. Most significantly, the apparitions began to interact directly with the current prisoners housed in Cell Block 3. The spectral figures would materialize within occupied cells, approaching the living inmates with gestures that conveyed urgent need for recognition and remembrance. The prisoners, initially terrified by these visitations, gradually came to understand that the apparitions posed no threat, but rather sought acknowledgement of their forgotten suffering. Marcus Kellerman, whose testimony had provided crucial insight into the phenomena, experienced the most profound interaction with the spectral inhabitants. The apparitions gathered around his cell in numbers that exceeded the physical capacity of the space, their forms overlapping and intermingling in ways that defied conventional understanding of matter and space. They appeared to recognize him as their primary conduit to the living world, focusing their collective attention upon him with an intensity that left him physically and emotionally overwhelmed. Dr. Thornfield's medical monitoring of the affected prisoners revealed physiological responses that correlated directly with the supernatural manifestations. Heart rates elevated during periods of apparitional activity, while body temperatures dropped in synchronization with the environmental cold spots. Most remarkably, several prisoners began to exhibit symptoms that mirrored those described in Dr. Brennan's journal accounts of the typhus epidemic, despite showing no signs of actual disease. The climax of the night's events occurred at 3 in the morning, when the apparitions throughout Cell Block 3 suddenly ceased their individual activities and turned their collective attention toward a single point in the corridor. The temperature in this location dropped to levels that caused frost to form on the stone walls, while the atmospheric pressure readings indicated disturbances that Professor Cartwright described as unprecedented in his experience. At this focal point, a figure materialized that differed markedly from the other apparitions. Dressed in the white coat of a physician rather than prison gray, this spectre bore the unmistakable features of Dr. Cornelius Brennan himself, as confirmed by comparison with photographs found in the medical archives. The ghostly physician moved through the cell block with the purposeful stride of a man conducting medical rounds, pausing at each cell to examine its occupant with the practiced eye of a healer. The manifestation of Dr. Brennan marked the beginning of the final phase of the supernatural events that had plagued Eastern State Penitentiary. The appearance of Dr. Brennan's spectral form marked the culmination of events that had been building throughout the winter months of 1892. His ghostly presence seemed to serve as a catalyst, drawing together the disparate manifestations into a coherent pattern that revealed the true purpose behind the supernatural visitations plaguing Cell Block 3. The phantom physician moved through the corridor with deliberate precision, his ethereal form pausing at each cell that housed one of the current prisoners. At every stop, he would extend his hand toward the iron door, and the spectral figures of the epidemic victims would materialize beside him, their faces bearing expressions of profound gratitude and recognition. The temperature readings during these encounters showed stabilization, rather than the extreme fluctuations that had characterized previous manifestations. Professor Cartwright's instruments detected a gradual normalization of atmospheric conditions as Dr. Brennan's spirit completed his rounds. The barometric pressure irregularities that had persisted throughout the night began to subside, while the localized cold spots that had defied explanation slowly warmed to match the ambient temperature of the cell block. The acoustic disturbances recorded by Professor Aldrich's equipment faded to silence, as if the urgent communications among the apparitions had finally achieved their intended purpose. The living prisoners within Cell Block 3 experienced a profound transformation during these final moments of supernatural activity. Marcus Kellerman, who had served as the primary witness to the phenomena, reported a sensation of overwhelming peace that replaced the anxiety and fear that had plagued him for weeks. The other affected inmates exhibited similar changes, their agitated behavior giving way to calm acceptance of their circumstances. Dr. Thornfield's medical observations documented the physiological changes that accompanied this spiritual resolution. The prisoners' elevated heart rates returned to normal ranges, while their body temperatures stabilized at healthy levels. The tremors and nervous symptoms that had characterized their condition throughout December disappeared entirely, leaving them in better physical condition than they had enjoyed since the manifestations began. Warden Creighton's final administrative report on the incidents provided a comprehensive summary of the events and their ultimate resolution. His document, written with the measured precision that had characterized his 20-year tenure, acknowledged the supernatural nature of the phenomena while maintaining the official discretion necessary to protect the institution's reputation. The warden's conclusion emphasized the importance of remembrance and recognition in providing peace to those who had suffered and died within the prison's walls. Miss Pemberton's archival research had revealed the key to understanding the apparition's purpose. The epidemic victims of 1863-1864 had been denied proper recognition of their suffering, their deaths concealed and their graves left unmarked. Their spectral return represented not malevolent haunting, but a desperate plea for acknowledgement of their humanity and remembrance of their tragic fate. The resolution came through the simple act of recognition itself. The documentation efforts undertaken by the prison staff, the careful recording of testimonies, and the systematic investigation of historical records had provided the acknowledgement that the spirits had sought for nearly 3 decades. By bearing witness to their experiences and preserving their stories, the living had fulfilled the obligation that the dead had been unable to articulate directly. In the weeks following the final manifestation, Warden Crichton implemented several changes to honor the memory of the epidemic victims. A small memorial plaque was installed in the administrative wing, acknowledging the 43 prisoners who had died during the typhus outbreak of 1863-1864. The unmarked graves beneath the exercise yard were properly consecrated, and a brief ceremony was conducted to provide the dignity in death that had been denied to them in life. The phenomena in Cell Block 3 ceased entirely following these commemorative actions. The temperature anomalies disappeared, the acoustic disturbances ended, and the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the affected area gave way to the normal conditions found throughout the rest of the prison. The current prisoners reported peaceful sleep and improved health, while the guards no longer experienced the unsettling sensations that had plagued their duties. Dr. Thornfield's final medical report concluded that the supernatural manifestations had represented a form of collective memory embedded within the physical structure of the prison itself. The intense suffering experienced by the epidemic victims had created what he termed psychic impressions that persisted until proper recognition and remembrance provided the resolution necessary for spiritual peace. The events at Eastern State Penitentiary during the winter of 1892 demonstrated the enduring power of human dignity and the fundamental need for recognition that transcends the boundaries between life and death, serving as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit demands acknowledgement and remembrance. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.